Hi everyone, hello and welcome to our latest session of the EVN Masterclasses. These masterclasses, as you know, are a really great opportunity for all of us to tap into some of the fantastic network of experts that BASIC is really lucky to have, who are joining us to share their expertise with the Emerging Voices Network. And as you know, these masterclasses are also aimed to be an accessible digital resource, primarily for you, our EVN members, but also for the general public. And so we now also, just to remind you, have a landing page on our BASIC website where you will be able to find the whole collection of our masterclasses so far, and we'll always make sure to update that so you can kind of refer back and watch these videos at any time. Today, we are joined by Professor Andrew Futter. Andrew is Professor of International Politics at the University of Leicester, UK, and also PI on the European Research Council-funded Third Nuclear Age project. He's also the author of numerous books and articles, including The Politics of Nuclear Weapons and Hacking the Bomb. He will be talking about the third nuclear age today. And as always, we're going to follow up with a discussion at the end of the session in case any of you would like to share any comments, any questions, or you'd like to continue the conversation on a little bit. And as a reminder, this session is of course recorded as well. So once this session is over, I will pass on this recording to you quite shortly within the week, so that you can kind of access this resource moving on before it goes public. And I think with that, I'll hand over to Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Bear with me while I try and make sure I get this bit right, because it's usually the bit that goes wrong. Can you see the shared screen? Have we got it? Excellent. Let me just make that a bit smaller. Great. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak and to share some ideas. This is, as I said to Anahida, this is a kind of a story of a work in progress. So some research that I was lucky enough 2 or 3 years ago to get some funding for from the European Research Council to look into this idea of whether we're moving into a new story of or new chapter of our nuclear story. We seem to be living in a world at the moment of real flux, not least because of what's happening in Ukraine, but there's a whole host of other dynamics that are going on, which seem to suggest that we're in a, if not necessarily completely new, then definitely a changing global nuclear order where we need to go back and think a bit about what we think we know about nuclear weapons and how we maintain nuclear peace, and all the implements and apparatus that we use to do that. So the idea here was to begin an exploration of what this new chapter, what this new context meant for how we essentially keep ourselves safe. As I say, this is an overview of a work in progress. The team and I are in year 3 of 5, so we don't necessarily have any concrete solutions yet. But what I hope to present is a kind of the evolution of the thinking, and I hope that's going to touch on a lot of the different issues that many of you will be interested in. I've included on there my email address and Twitter account. Please feel free to get in contact with me if you don't have time, or if you're not on this call now and you watch this later, or if you, as often happens to me, have a good idea for a question 10 minutes after the session is finished. Please do feel free to get in touch. And likewise, there's the project website where you can learn a bit more about the team and about some of the things that we've been doing, if that's of interest too. So this all began probably 5 or 6 years ago with a very technological focus, with a feeling that the development and deployment of new, exotic, novel weapon systems, and especially non-nuclear capable weapon systems, was having, or was beginning to have, a pretty significant impact on how we understand nuclear risk, deterrence, arms control, balances, strategic stability, etc. And this kind of originated in the United States, and in reality can probably be traced back maybe even 20 or 30 years to the revolution in military affairs, the first Gulf War, the Kosovo War, and the wars in the Gulf. But what we began to see in the US sense, and then replicated by others, is this increasing reliance on very advanced, very capable, very accurate conventional weaponry. And this was part of a much broader technological change across society that's been driven by the information revolution, where almost everything we do has become digitized and changed in many different ways. And our nuclear world and the types of capabilities that we use within this were also changing. So the original label that we used for this was advanced conventional weapons, but increasingly we began to use the moniker of strategic non-nuclear weapons. Advanced conventional weapons seem to suggest that conventional has to be or can't include non-kinetic or sort of non-traditional means, whereas non-strategic can as well, but we'll come back to that. So there's no real fixed conception of what this label included, but as you can imagine, it's things such as ballistic missile defenses, more accurate precision strike missiles, including hypersonic boost and hypersonic cruise, a whole range of questions and problems and capabilities associated with cyber or computer network operations, the return of anti-satellite capabilities, hugely enhanced underwater monitoring in terms of trying to find nuclear-armed submarines, and increasingly a whole range of dynamics associated with artificial intelligence and with automation across the nuclear space. And what was really interesting, I think, here is it wasn't just one technology that perhaps we focused on in the past that seemed to be particularly problematic, whether it be ICBMs, MIRVs, submarines, stealth bombers, etc., but actually a whole host of different technologies that were reaching fruition and being developed at the same time. And that, of course, I think massively increases the significance of what they potentially can do. Now, when we began this, we weren't trying to suggest that these new types of capabilities or emerging and disruptive technologies, as some may label them, fundamentally change everything, but that it does necessitate a bit of a rethink about some of the central ideas that nuclear order is based on. And don't forget that much of what we think of as nuclear orthodoxy is developed probably by a group of people that look rather like me, but a bit older, somewhere in the United States. It's a very small cabal of people that actually came up with this stuff. And there's a reason to suggest that we need to go back, reassess, rethink, and challenge some of that stuff. So why should we be worried about this initial technological challenge? Well, it seems to be quite different to the past because many of these capabilities are non-nuclear, non-kinetic, non-tangible, dual use and dual capable. So that is dual use in terms of can be used for both military and civilian applications or means, and dual capable, meaning that they might be used for both nuclear and conventional weapon systems. And these seem to all be reaching fruition at the same time. And increasingly, it wasn't just the United States doing this, but actually a whole range of other actors too. We've seen some of these capabilities that have been used in Ukraine. We've seen China push ahead with a number of them, but also India and a number of other countries too. But in addition to these particular types of capabilities and weapons and potentially new missions, it was also this broader context or the information environment that was changing. So where once it was very difficult to get information on what was going on or situational awareness, now the problem is quite reversed and there's just simply too much. We live in a world of instant access to all sorts of information and at the same time, an ability to shape that information space within which nuclear and other decisions are being made. Another significant shift was that this is increasingly a global phenomenon. There are many different actors that are interested in these different types of technologies. In the past, we focused very much on just two, the United States or the United States and the West and the Soviet Union and Russia. But this is now much more of a global game, and not just in terms of those three major poles in the US, Russia and China, but with India, Pakistan, the increasing importance of other actors outside of the traditional nuclear space, such as Nigeria, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, and many others too. So we have this world where all of the major, where all of the current nuclear armed states are in the process of modernizing or augmenting their nuclear capabilities, and at the same time seem very interested in these other types of weaponry too. And because they're non-nuclear, there's a feeling that these could be more usable in different types of roles, not necessarily and specifically for a counter force role, although that is a counter nuclear force role, although that is a possibility, but much more in terms of making conventional war fighting more credible and more possible. And again, this has significant implications for how we think about the nuclear condition, what we mean by strategic stability, deterrence, arms control, and the kind of balances, the delicate balances on which our nuclear world is based. And it leads to the question of whether we still have the correct conceptual and policy frameworks to understand this. Going back to the previous slide, these are very Western US-centric ideas of our nuclear world and what it means. They are also ideas that were developed in a very different time, that look very different to where we are today. I think there's beginning increasingly so a recognition in the literature about this challenge, and most conferences that I'm sure people go to now will have some aspect of emerging and disruptive technology or new weapons involved in it. But I think these analyses still tend to be quite limited in their scope, both in terms of a focus on often particular weapon systems, particular countries or dyads, and not really trying to join this up together. So what we were really trying to do with this project is to say, well, let's stand back and see what does this really mean in terms of that global nuclear order that we're all part of. One of the ways, so the project began with the idea that we're moving into a new nuclear age, and just to give a bit of a background to this idea, and again, this is a very Western, US, Euro-Atlantic centric view of nuclear history. But the idea is broadly that you can split nuclear history since 1945 into two nuclear ages. A first nuclear age, which is broadly contiguous with the Cold War, between the rivalry between East and West, the US and Soviet Union, where we were all, although most people on this call probably won't have been born, but where most people were really concerned about arms racing, about major nuclear exchange, particularly in Europe. We had the development of mutually assured destruction as a condition, this idea of secure retaliation, massive stockpiles, and this is all based on a bipolar world. So our focus and our major concern was between the two superpowers, their allies, and the risk of major war. And then analysts would have it that with the end of the Cold War in 1990, 1991, we see a shift. Essentially, the main focus of our concern shifts to nuclear proliferation, to so-called irrational, rogue, and also non-state actors. So no longer is it the threat of major interstate nuclear war that concerns us, but actually it's the nuclear programs or the WMD programs in Iraq, North Korea, Iran, and several other possible states as well. And this is a real shift in terms of where globally we see the main threat, and of course, therefore, what has to be protected against, or what international regimes and international frameworks need to secure. So what we see during the second nuclear age is the beginning of a focus on nuclear security, on counter-proliferation, the extension of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1995, the continuation of stability based on mutual vulnerability, but in a much less pronounced state than it was in the first nuclear age. And what we begin to see, particularly in debates in the United States, is ideas of tailored and diversified nuclear deterrence, whereby it may no longer be possible just to rely on retaliation through nuclear weapons, but actually it may require preemptive or preventative action. You could argue that this is the context in which you see the 2003 Iraq War, but it's also the context of which you see a growing interest, most notably during the George W. Bush administration, on missile defense and on precision, conventional precision strike systems that might be used to take out terrorists or used against an adversary's nuclear weapon systems. And this is broadly seen as being the era of US hegemony, a very much a unipolar system of fairly unchallenged US power. This is not to say that Russia and China didn't exist as problems or concerns, but they were much less of an issue compared with, if you like, the regional and non-state actor threat. Well, what we began to suggest with this project is that the world is changing again, and not necessarily just because of the over the last year or so with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but actually going back a bit before that, not just the annexation of Crimea in 2014, but a gradual shift away from US unipolarity and power preponderance towards a more multipolar system. The so-called rise of China, and certainly China becoming a much more significant player within the system, a sort of Russian return to great power politics after several decades of kind of dealing with its own internal issues, but also the rise of India and the rise of other actors within this system as well. This does not mean that the US has been completely supplanted as the most powerful state in the system, but that there are others now challenging, that we have different poles, and most importantly, that these poles are now nuclear armed. We've had global systems in the past that have been multipolar, but never have those poles been armed with nuclear weapons, and that represents a significant change. So when we add that to what I've just said about the development of different weapons systems, we now have a more competitive international order and a far wider range of weapons and capabilities that could be used for strategic missions. And this, I think, makes a shift away from the focus on so-called rogue actors, proliferation threats, back towards major power, nuclear war, and war between the major powers. And one of the challenges here becomes that the technologies that are being developed lead to deliberate or inadvertent nuclear use or escalation between the powers. And this may well be from a conventional war, which seems, especially with Ukraine, the world may be becoming more, or may have to accept as becoming more likely, or it may simply be from misunderstanding or some other problem that arises in a conflict or crisis. So another aspect that we have of this, so we have technological change, we have geopolitical change, and then we have normative change as well. And I think the most clear manifestation of that is the 2017 Nuclear Ban Treaty, or the TPNW. Now, I don't suspect the TPNW is going to drive us towards nuclear disarmament anytime soon, but what it does do is fundamentally highlight that many other states within this global nuclear order that don't have nuclear weapons are really running out of patience with those, with the 5 states that are legally obliged to work towards disarmament, and the states outside the NPT that are simply not making those moves in the right way. And I think what we're seeing also as part of this third nuclear age, therefore, is a bifurcation in the global nuclear order between those who see stability and a future and peace that can be based on deterrence, and those that see that it has to be based on disarmament. So we have this, I would argue there's a strong case to be made that we are in a new chapter of our nuclear story, and one that we need to look at some slightly different aspects to really understand. One final thing that I'll add looking at this as well, I think the third nuclear age is going to be very much more global than the first and second. They're very much, first nuclear age is Euro-Atlantic centric. Second nuclear age is very much about the US and what it saw as threats. The third nuclear age, I think, is about global, different powers within the international system that have different understandings and different desires and different needs out of that system. I think it'll be a much more diverse and much broader one, but I'll come back to that later in the talk. So one of the first things we did as part of the project is that Ben Zala and I, a colleague at the Australian National University, developed some of these ideas into, well, what might this technological impact in the third nuclear age look like? What is the impact of these so-called strategic non-nuclear weapons? And we were lucky enough to get this published a few years ago in the European Journal of International Security. And that article essentially made 3 claims. That first, the thinking in terms of nuclear ages, while somewhat flawed because it's based on a very Euro-Atlantic Western view of the world and view of our history, is nevertheless a useful vehicle to think about nuclear risks and nuclear order, not least because it captures that change between different epochs and between things that really worry us and the hierarchy of those threats. Second, that it wasn't so much about particular capabilities, weapons, or missions that we should be worried, so whether it's cyber, hypersonics, or whatever other kind of sexy phrase or capability was doing the rounds a particular week, but actually about how all of these things combined, about how this changed the ability to achieve certain strategic outcomes, but also how this increased risks and misunderstanding and of how things may go wrong. But also, of course, something that isn't new, but perhaps got forgotten, that it's the perceptions of this that matter as much as it is what is actually deployed, particularly when it comes to non-tangible capabilities. And thirdly, Ben and I developed a kind of a framework to think about what this might look like in the medium to longer term. So if the third nuclear age is going to be about the development of both nuclear and non-nuclear weaponry at a rapid pace by a number of different actors, what does this look like? And is there a way that we can mitigate and navigate towards a more peaceful world within this? And I think the ultimate point that Ben and I wanted to make is that whether you agreed with our framing of this around a third nuclear age or not, this was clearly something that we needed to think about, because it was changing the way that a number of different states go about assuring their security, and therefore, challenging the very nature of the nuclear order in which we will try and keep secure. So these 4 possible scenarios, and there may well be others that people can think of. I'm not saying these are the only ones, but this struck us as quite a good way of trying to, I don't know, unpack and think through what this might look like going forward. So we suggested that the most likely scenario from the current vantage point is that leading states or major powers, and indeed some middle powers, would continue to build strategic non-nuclear weapons, and at the same time we would have nuclear proliferation and this would lead to sort of strategic instability and increased risks of conventional war fighting and potentially arms racing. And I think, unfortunately, that is kind of where we are at the moment. A second scenario is the strategic non-nuclear weapons deployment or development deployment by major powers produces some sort of temporary strategic advantage. So one state believes that it has acquired a capability to conduct a counter force attack against an adversary, or to carry out a particular strategic mission or coercion because it feels it now has the technological advantage. This is clearly the most destabilizing, because there would be potential windows of opportunity to use these capabilities and to act in that way. This wouldn't necessarily be the United States, although that seems the most likely actor at the moment, but it could well be any one of a number of other different actors vis-a-vis their different security environments and adversaries. A third scenario would be the deployment of advanced or strategic conventional weapons or we somehow find a way of inducing some sort of restraint. So we go back to the arms control frameworks, we find ways to limit and mitigate the worst and most worrying aspects of these weapons. So this would be very similar to some of the frameworks that were built around nuclear weapons beginning in the late 1960s. This would be a world where nuclear weapons would remain central, because there would be less of a push to break out by developing conventional systems. But this is potentially, and depending on your viewpoint, the most appealing in terms of mitigating some of the risks described in scenarios 1 and 2. A final possible scenario, and perhaps more theoretical and perhaps more long-term, is that the deployment of non-nuclear weaponry by major powers becomes the currency of international politics. We get to a point whereby missile defenses, precision weapons, cyber, AI, all of these things actually undermine the value of nuclear weapons and create a space whereby nuclear weapons are no longer seen as absolutely essential to security. This would be a world of disarmament through technological change rather than through political, ethical, or moral pressures. This, on the surface, may seem very, very appealing for those that want to move towards a nuclear weapons field. This may be one of the most likely avenues to get there. But it's also potentially the one where we see a much more of a return to conventional warfare, where we see the potentially deterring effects of nuclear weapons undermined, depending again on your view of whether they do or don't, and a world that is actually more conflict prone, but perhaps the consequences of that conflict are not quite as dire as in the nuclear era. This led us on to thinking a bit about so a lot of this talk around strategic non-nuclear weaponry seemed to get lumped in with this idea of emerging and disruptive technology, which I'm sure all of you have been familiar with. So the next strand of this project was to say, well, what does this actually mean? You know, when we use this phrase, what are we referring to, and how significant is this? And as I'm sure many people on the call will be aware, it became pretty clear quite early that this means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And some technologies are more mature than others. Some technologies or some capabilities are potentially more dangerous or potentially more transformative than others. And of course, not everybody is developing the same types of systems for the same types of missions or same types of reasons. There's also something that came through with this work, which was published in an EU Non-Proliferation Disarmament Consortium paper and in Survival, that actually a lot of these challenges are not really as new as is often made out. Many of these things that we talk about are actually emerged. Hypersonic technology is not that new. ASAT is definitely not that new. Missile defense has been around right from the beginning of the nuclear age. And even actually what we think about cyber and AI are not as new as many people would necessarily have you. So these are not necessarily new problems, but perhaps the technology is increasing to a point where they're becoming more significant in terms of what can be achieved. It struck me that lumping everything together under this emerging and disruptive moniker was not particularly helpful, because there's so much difference between what might or may not be achieved by a particular capability, and indeed for the reasons that may or may not be stated by those developing them. And I think one other thing that came from this, and maybe this has been over the past sort of 4 or 5 years, is that using the label emerging and disruptive technology, everybody got immediately got really, really worried. Oh, this sounds dreadful. We don't really understand it, therefore it must be awful. And there was an awful amount of hype that surrounded this as well, that was led, I think, by a lack of understanding about what this was. For example, the fact that a hypersonic weapon is not really that different from what you can do with a cruise or ballistic missile, and a whole host of other examples that you could use there as well. And then the other point that we made in these sort of papers was that there's a real danger of focusing too much on technology. That if we look too much at technology, we always see the worst case scenarios and always kind of assume that it will be used in the worst possible way. But the reality is that this is all based on politics. There are political decisions about developing this stuff. It's not always particularly rational. It's not always particularly well thought out why some technologies or some weapon systems are deployed. And that therefore it is about political decisions about this stuff. And that just because you may be able to do something with a particular piece of military hardware doesn't mean it's likely, doesn't mean it's something that makes a lot of sense. So it's going back to ground technological change in politics and in political decisions. And this, of course, suggests that some of those environments that are discussed in the 4 scenarios discussed in the last slide are by no means a foregone conclusion. They're not something that we have to accept. They can be shaped by us, and particularly by policymakers. I just wanted to go in a little bit to talk about some of the sort of the nuances within some of these technologies. I won't talk about all of them because there's quite a lot here, but just to refer back to hypersonic weapons, it's not that there was a real hype around this that somehow warfare is going to change, that nuclear order is going to change because of hypersonic weapons, and that really misses the kind of point. Maneuverable missiles, whether they be cruise or ballistic, have been around for a long time. The speed is pretty much the same in terms of a very fast hypersonic weapon. Most ballistic missiles travel at hypersonic speeds. Some of the challenges you get in terms of warhead ambiguity, target ambiguity, these are exactly the same with other missiles as well. So I think there was a lot of hype and a lot of focus put on a technology that actually didn't really change things considerably in terms of what was there already. Another good example, I think, would perhaps be ballistic missile defense. Again, it's not a new technology, but the big challenge there is so much that it is becoming more normalized. Technology is becoming increasingly capable, both in terms of particularly the space-based assets or ground-based radar that are used to track, as well as interception. But I think the big thing with BMD that perhaps gets lost within this is the move from not just having so-called right of launch missile defense, which is essentially trying to shoot down things with interceptor missiles in a kinetic manner, but the move towards what's been termed left of launch or full spectrum missile defense, whereby it may become possible to prevent a launch through a cyber attack or electronic interference or a number of different ways, something that looks very much more like preemption. And this is an idea that's rumored to have been circulating in the United States. It's possible, or at least there was some media attention, that a failed North Korean missile launch was down to a left of launch cyber attack or full spectrum missile defense attack by the US. We don't know whether that's true, but it's possible. And this, I think, takes us into a much more dangerous world. So it's not just that missile defense is becoming more important, but it's that the nature of how missile defense is achieved is becoming much more significant and potentially much more worrying. There's a whole host of other technologies that you could look at under this: nanotechnology, quantum, a whole host of things related to quantum, 3D printing, directed energy weapons. So it's quite a diverse space in terms of what we're actually looking at in terms of the capabilities that fall under this moniker. And just to stress again, these are being pursued differently by different actors, and they have different implications depending on what you're doing. Yes, there's clearly the possibility of a threat to secure second strike capabilities, particularly, I would say, for countries such as the UK, that relies on just one method or one means of nuclear delivery. Those submarines are very sophisticated. Our missiles and warheads are very sophisticated, but they are basically a single point of failure if an adversary develops better missile defense, underwater warfare capabilities, or other stuff. It suggests that we need to go and rethink what arms control means. Maybe look back at some of the original ideas, the sort of Schelling-Halperin stuff, which actually goes far beyond just treaties and a whole host of informal, unilateral or kind of unilateral mechanisms, and really rethink about what it is we're trying to control beyond nuclear weapons. But perhaps most importantly, this idea of we'll probably see new escalation pathways across different domains, whether that be the traditional military domains, but increasingly, I think, across both space and cyberspace as well. And that's something that we haven't, as a world, I suppose, as a kind of a group of people interested in nuclear order, really begun to think through how we mitigate those risks. So the third thing that we began to do was to start putting some of this technological change in context. So as you can see there, the central bit was kind of, trying to look at some of the nuances of what technological change meant, trying to make sure that we're not trying to say this is homogenous, and also introducing the political aspect of it as well. And this is because it was very much the case that you cannot view technology in isolation. It is inherently political, but it's also linked in with so many other things that are going on too. And what this began to suggest, or the way we began moving with this, is to look at three different aspects that we're linking in with technology as well. The first was that the technological change and the seriousness of this change was clearly reflective of changes in geopolitics and multipolarity, some of the stuff that I talked about at the start in terms of nuclear ages, and that these new types of capabilities are clearly becoming the currency of competition between the US, Russia, China, and indeed many others. So geopolitical shifts, changing the way that states, particularly middle powers, think about alliances and where power is in the international system was a key first point. A second key point was normative shifts, which I mentioned before, the TPNW, the nuclear ban treaty, but also increasing activism from states in the global south, but both in terms of disarmament advocacy and, if you like, running out of patience with those small number of states that have nuclear weapons and their lack of progress on moving towards disarmament, but also the increased significance of nuclear energy for states in the global south as well. There is a feeling that the benefits of the nuclear revolution in terms of development and economic opportunities has been very much centered in the Western developed world, and that despite the fact that the non-proliferation treaty guarantees rights of states to access that technology, that this hasn't really been fulfilled. So we're seeing at the same time a pressure from the non-aligned world, the global south, for disarmament, and at the same time a pressure to reap some of the benefits of nuclear technology in terms of power generation. And then a third point that we wanted to really bring out here was that if we are in a third nuclear age, there may not be one absolute set of characteristics that apply to all, that it may be experienced differently by different actors, that actually the timelines may be different, again, that focus on a very Western idea of it, and that we really need to look into regional and country and broader differences between how this third nuclear age is experienced and what different actors want from it and how they may go about doing that. And this began to move us, linking in with the point in normative shifts, to move not away from nuclear weapons as a focus, but to see that as only one part of a changing order that we needed to focus on. And you probably get a bit bored of the self of me putting up all the links, but this was something I explored in a paper for the Hiroshima Organization for Global Peace. And then the final thing that we've begun to do, the team and I, and we've got some nice mugshots of the team that I'm working with here at Leicester, is to look into, well, if this is a differentiated global phenomenon, how do we classify these different states, or how do we characterize the different types of responses to this third nuclear age? And it goes back to that point that this is not all about nuclear weapons. So there are actually different interests, there are different dynamics that are shaping this world, and that will build in or will impact the way that we understand nuclear peace. And so this is still a work in progress. We haven't finished this book yet, but we began to work on this basis that there might be 4 different pathways to nuclear security in the third nuclear age. So there is a group that we've labeled the traditionalists, or the nuclear firsters, where nuclear weapons for a number of different reasons remain essential. This is, interestingly, the United States, despite the US appearing to be desperate to break out of nuclear stalemate through technological change. Indeed, in many of the systems we talked earlier in this presentation, nuclear weapons are back as being fundamental for the US, not least because of extended deterrence relationships. Russia, Pakistan, North Korea, France, all absolutely wedded to nuclear weapons for albeit quite different reasons. And I think, interestingly, Russia, Pakistan, and North Korea all interested in tactical nuclear weapons for battlefield and warfighting purposes. Next, we have a group that you can sort of label the hedgers and balancers. And these are states that haven't really committed one way or another, and they're sort of just, again, trying to hedge their bets, sit on the fence in terms of what to do. But a key part of their response has been through an increased reliance on alliances. And probably the best example of this is the UK. The UK has made some fairly minimal changes to its its overarching nuclear position in terms of an increased warhead stockpile, ending transparency. But actually, the really important thing is doubling down on NATO, AUKUS, the United States. They're the really important parts of the UK's response. India is similar. I'm not sure. Research we've done suggests that India is not entirely sure which is the best pathway to security. There is a slow increase in the Indian nuclear stockpile, but I think ideas of a conventional, of a counterforce role have been overplayed. Likewise, India is slowly developing a missile defense system, has an interest in nuclear armed submarines and an interest in hypersonic weapons, but none of these seem to have absolutely nailed on strategic rationales. And I think the same is true for a number of others too. A group that perhaps more closely resembled where we started the presentation are what we call the tech transformationalists. And these are states that appear to be trying to utilize new technologies to break out of their current security positions, but importantly, with conventional weaponry. So South Korea and Taiwan are the really obvious examples here. South Korea developing a conventional counterforce or kill chain policy to try and hold the North Korean leadership vulnerable. Taiwan spending an awful lot of money on various different advanced conventional military equipment to try and deter Chinese intervention. Israel, likewise. Australia, as part of this AUKUS deal, seems to, and a recent defense paper or defense document that has been released, seems to have recognized that it needs to take more control for its own security in terms of conventional weapons. And Japan is another good example as well. But perhaps the most interesting in terms of the history of global nuclear order and why the third nuclear age may be different is this group that we've described as the activists and protesters. So these are states that don't have nuclear weapons, but that nevertheless are important stakeholders within the global nuclear order and have an impact on how it is shaped. These are not homogenous either. So broadly, Austria, South Africa, Brazil, Kazakhstan, Indonesia are all disarmament seeking or supporting states, but in quite different ways. Austria is the poster child of the ban treaty. South Africa is interesting because, of course, it's the one state to give up its own independent functioning nuclear program, albeit it was only a few bombs. Brazil is an interesting case in terms of pushing for disarmament, but actually almost being more interested in pushing back against Western dominance of the nuclear order, and Indonesia likewise. So you have these different poles of power that are interested in disarmament, but they're also interested in challenging what is often seen as the double standards of the P5, the nuclear armed states, but particularly of the Western underpinnings of some of those institutions. And this led to kind of where we are now, which is to think about, well, if this is a third nuclear age, what does it actually include? And as you can see from this, it's moved on quite a long way from the first slide, which was focused heavily on technology. And I think, and this is still a work in progress, but I think it just suggests that the third nuclear age is going to be far more complex than what has come before. So as you can see up in the, I think it'll be your left-hand corner, there's rapid technological change in non-nuclear weapons is still very important. The one next to it to the right is almost as important. The third nuclear age, nuclear weapons are back. We may not like it, people may not be very pleased about that, but it seems to me that that is pretty indisputable, that nuclear weapons are back in importance for almost all nuclear armed states, their allies, the extended guarantees, and a whole host of states around the side. There is this growing fissure within global nuclear governance between those that see a future of disarmament and those that see a future that even temporarily has to be based on deterrence. There's a return of the idea of conventional war fighting, sometimes under the nuclear shadow, under the nuclear umbrella. Nuclear energy has become really, really important in a world that is determined to move towards net zero. For a lot of countries, nuclear still represents a very attractive proposition. And we're seeing this particularly from states in the global south. And with what we've seen in Ukraine and other parts, this raises a whole host of questions, not just in terms of security and proliferation, but also for power plants being attacked and the possible radiation release in any future conflicts. There's a whole host of things around challenging Western nuclear centrism. This is something I think is particularly important given somebody who is Western and from this kind of small group that kind of is linked with a lot of the ideas of how we understand nuclear order, but actually trying to think of this as a global problem with different views and not just through the eyes of the developed Western world. There's a need to rethink the condition and narrative, to think outside the box, to get new views, but also to go back to some of the ideas of arms control and of risk reduction that have been there in the past, but that perhaps we haven't, or perhaps we've lost, or perhaps we've just simply forgotten about. And then finally, I think, given what the world has gone through over the past 4 years, the importance of interconnected existential threats. Nuclear weapons and risks surrounding nuclear weapons, warfare and nuclear armed states is just one risk in a world that is now dominated by a number of other things. One of the obvious of these is pandemics that affect everybody, but also the link with climate change, both in terms of the importance of nuclear energy for meeting climate goals, but also, of course, in the problems for the climate should any sort of nuclear release or let alone explosion happen. So this is that there is a risk that this is becoming so broad that it kind of loses focus. But I think what we're trying to grasp at is that this is a complex third nuclear age, and that actually there's a lot of things going on. And the richer the kind of the narrative and the empirics, the more we'll actually be able to understand what it means. And then I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I'll finish up with a few thoughts going forward from where we are. So when we started this project, there was a real focus on technology. Technology hasn't become less important, but it's become clear that you cannot understand technological change, emerging disruptive tech, etc., without thinking about politics, geopolitics, and norms. And for want of a better way of describing it, technology is the center of an onion, and we have these different layers that surround it in terms of the importance. And norms is probably the outer layer within which all of this happens. This is something that a friend of mine, Benoit Pelopidis, quite often says, but don't assume that what we think worked in the past will work in the future. So we have a whole host of really good arms control frameworks, governance, norms, ideas that we built in the past, but we shouldn't assume that they will continue to work. We need to constantly be updating and thinking about making sure these are fit for purpose and addressing the reality of what faces us. Linked to that, there's a need to reimagine arms control, governance, and disarmament. There's still a role for many of the old ideas, but we should challenge these. We should try and look beyond it. And I think groups like this one are exactly the right place for that. Blue sky thinking, or thinking outside the box, and to come up with different types of ways of how we manage nuclear risks. The third nuclear age, or a key part of the third nuclear age, is recognizing that there is a diverse range of interests and actors involved in the global nuclear order. This feeds into a broader thing within, I don't know, with academic scholarship of trying to engage or understand or bring in forgotten stakeholders. And I think that's particularly the global south. And I think the global nuclear order, or the non-aligned world as well. And I think the global nuclear order has been particularly bad at that. And that's something that it needs to do going forward. The nuclear, non-nuclear distinctions becoming increasingly blurred. That is worrying. The types of non-nuclear capabilities being deployed today are completely different from the types of things we think about in terms of conventional weapons in the past. The importance to focus on pathways to nuclear use and risk reduction rather than on particular weapons or domains. It's not particularly useful thinking about cyber wars. We need to think about this as a joined up whole, and how different types of capabilities, different domains, different capabilities will interact. One of the big aspects of the big characteristics of the third nuclear age will be a reduction in decision-making time because of the highly digitized, real-time information environment within which we all live, and policymakers make decisions. So therefore, how to build in time, facilitate dialogue, increase transparency are all incredibly important things that we should focus on. Perceptions matter as much, if not more, than realities and capabilities. And I think, again, we have to be very careful that just because we think we're signaling something, that an opponent or an adversary or even a partner takes the same message from it. I think that's often overlooked. There's a real importance of nuclear education and raising awareness amongst different types of stakeholders. For the best part of 2 generations, nuclear security or nuclear politics just fell off most academic courses. Most academic departments didn't teach this stuff. It's slowly coming back now, but there's a real importance to raise awareness around that. And then finally, and this is linked, is to try and encourage unconventional approaches to nuclear problems. There's no, you all heard this, the phrase, there's no such thing as silly ideas. And I think that's really true. Get people in a room, come up with things, and you never quite know where that will go. So that gives you a bit of an overview of the story of the project. Hopefully a few interesting things to get our teeth into there. And please feel free to ask me any questions about any of the bits that you want to know more or didn't understand.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I think, as you've mentioned, there lies a whole new range of challenges ahead, and it's going to be really interesting to see how some of these things play out. And I think for a lot of our Emerging Voices Network members who are working on some of these issues and kind of looking to how they're going to be involved in addressing some of them, this will have been really, really cool to listen to. So I think we'll kick off. We have a bit of time for some questions now. So if you do have any comments or you'd just like to add to the discussion, feel free to just raise your hand and we'll bring you in. And if you're unable to speak at the moment, you can always just drop your comments or thoughts and questions into the chat and I'll read it out for you. So I'll just give a bit of time in case anyone does have anything they'd like to ask. Yeah, Declan, go ahead.
Thanks, Anita, and yeah, thanks for a really good talk, Andrew. It's been really interesting to see the nuclear age project develop over the last couple of years. So I think I guess my question at the moment is from the perspective of research that I've been doing, but also from some of the different articles I've been reading and different issues around arms control and some Twitter discourse as well that I've seen between particularly lately Russian focused or Russian born academics talking about the issues of arms control treaties and communication. And I was wondering on how big the role you felt of the differences in the perceptions around these technologies and how different states interpret the importance of certain technologies. Because one thing that I'd seen come out of these debates was certain states unable to kind of come together and make arms control arrangements, or to understand how their own behavior was problematic, or this technology they were going for was problematic, because, you know, say between the US and the United States, something that the US might develop and think wasn't as escalatory might be seen as much more escalatory for Russia, for example. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on kind of the role that not just the technology itself, but the perceptions of the role that they plays in the nuclear age.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think that's a really important point, and it comes back to something I said about just because we're doing something and think we're sending a message doesn't mean that that's the message that's heard by others. And I'll send it back to answer your question, but I'll give you an example. So the UK integrated review and the Associated Defence Command paper raised that the warhead ceiling to whatever it is, 260, or I can't remember, and ended transparency about what's being deployed on submarines. And the kind of the message that I think the UK wanted to send out with that was, deterrence has changed a little bit. We're just making a little bit of allowance to allow for this. The message that I think was heard in other parts of the world was not that at all. The message in other parts of the world, speaking to, was, oh, the UK thinks nuclear weapons are really important again. The UK is doing this, and then others would say, well, they've done this, they've caused loads of problems, we're not really sure what the benefits are. So it's just an example of how something that UK government did, for what I suspect probably are reasonable reasons, is interpreted very differently by different actors. And interestingly, speaking to Russian friends, none of them cared, didn't think it was important, right? So ironically, and don't quote me on this, but ironically, I would suspect one of the main reasons for that is increases in Russian missile defense ability, some concerns about future security of the warhead and other stuff, but the Russians don't even care, right? So there's an example of that. You're absolutely right in terms of there's different. It's why it's really important to look at what different capabilities are being developed for. A good example here would be hypersonic weapons. So the Russians appear to see Boost Glide as a good strategic nuclear delivery vehicle because it would ostensibly get around US missile defenses, although arguably they'd be able to do that anyway. The US, as far as I can tell, doesn't see a nuclear role for hypersonic missiles. They would be much more of something that would augment Tomahawk. So it'd be for land attack primarily, maybe maritime attack, but conventional. And that brings with it a whole range of extra challenges because you have to be so much more accurate if you're not going to use a nuclear warhead, whereas the Russians don't. The Chinese seem to have a whole host of different programs going on for different reasons. And talking to a Chinese expert recently, there's not necessarily any joined up thinking about why that is. It's just a case of let's build some of these things because we can. So there's an example of 3 different rationales for broadly developing the same technology, and that makes arms control really difficult because they're not all being pursued for exactly the same purpose. Whereas if you go back to the Cold War, US and Russian ICBMs broadly had exactly the same purpose. Therefore, it would probably be easier to understand how you can balance them. Now, this is not to say that you can't have arms control within a technological across those systems, but that we probably have to be a bit more creative. One of the things that I've wondered about before is whether you can have a kind of an arms control mixture. So if you want to have a certain number of different types of launches, whether you can choose whether you want that to be glide vehicle, cruise missile, ballistic missile, different ranges, whatever else, but you choose the mix within that to suit your security requirements. The other thing that underpins this, and I don't want to sound too kind of pessimistic, but arms control traditionally in the nuclear realm has happened once states have got to a position where they feel they can do arms control, when they've built enough. It doesn't tend to happen before. So we are at the start of a technological shift, and that is not normally the time when you get arms control, at least not in. As long as the major players see a value in, whether it be hypersonic weapons, missile defense, whatever it is, it's hard to see a rationale of why they would give that up. From the current viewpoint, if we were to stop it, if we found a way to restrain everything now, the country that would benefit from that would be the United States. So therefore, the Russians, the Chinese, India have a real incentive to try and catch up and to make sure they're part of that conversation properly. And this is and this doesn't sit well with disarmament advocates, but a number of states see a real value in these capabilities, right? That they see immediate security concerns that can be met by this, and that makes it very difficult for arms control. So arms control may not. So arms control is a big toolkit, and I guess what I'm talking about there is legally binding formal limitations on particular types of systems. I don't think we're there at the moment. I think that's really difficult, not least because of where we go after New Start and what that looks like. But what we may be better off thinking about is risk reductions. What can we do around this stuff that makes misperceptions, accidents, unintended escalation less likely? And there are a number of different things you can do. It's not as sexy, it's not as exciting, it's not as headline grabbing, but they do kind of make things more secure. And then one final thing that's been coming out of a lot of events that I've been in recently is we just need to prepare ourselves that this sometimes for arms control to work. Arms control is not the same thing as disarmament. They can be linked, but they don't have to be. And that the only way to get to this to get to arms control is to build up stuff. Right, that may not sit very palatably with people, but that might be how we get there. Maybe we have to accept there's a build up to get to a point where we can have stability through arms control, and the pathway to disarming goes a bit like this. So I know I've talked a bit around your question there, but it's a really good question because there's a lot of different aspects to it. And I think the point being is arms control was never easy in the past, but it's become more complex today in terms of how it looks. And then the final thing I'll add on is that all of these states and actors that are watching outside of the nuclear armed states and their allies are increasingly looking for signs that the nuclear armed states are doing something, and that's really hard. There are not many easy things, for example, the UK can do to signal commitment to disarmament and to arms control in a world where everybody else is building up and sees strategic competition as a key part of the environment they face. So I don't know if I've answered your question head on, but I guess the point I want to make is that it's a really good one because it's much more complicated, I think, than in the past.
Thank you. Whilst I just wait just to see if there are any other questions, I'd be curious. I know that you touched a little bit on, where the third nuclear age project itself is at the moment and the fact that it's 3 years in. I was wondering if you could maybe expand on what comes next with these findings and what you're hoping for the outcomes of the project to be. And also, I guess, maybe to tail end on that, do you think that, for example, states, with some of those categorizations of the states that you've made, will they be responsive and receptive to these ideas of, kind of tackling a bit of the Eurocentrism of existing kind of traditional security ideas and practices, or maybe starting to come to terms with the fact that we're possibly turning into a multipolar system, that kind of thing?
Yeah, great question. I'll do the first bit. Do the second bit first, and then come on to the longer range things. So I think what we're seeing in all aspects of international politics is the global South becoming more important in general. And by the global South, I have a lot of different ideas about who that is. I mean, you can include India in that. Basically, the non-Western world is becoming more and more influential, and that's in a number of different ways, economically, but also as a result of multipolarity. There are now different major powers that you can look to in terms of security or economic development, and indeed different major powers you can balance off against each other to achieve those things. I think the voices from the non-Western world have always been there. They just haven't really been listened to. So the non-aligned movement and their interest in disarmament, their interest in civilian nuclear energy, these aren't new things. They go back, decades, but they're becoming more and more important because those states, those middle powers, are becoming more influential. What Brazil thinks about international order, what India does, is actually increasingly important in how we shape it. Now, I don't know if that means that we upturn, or there's any way we upturn the kind of institutions of international order and nuclear order, but that there will be increased pressure from these actors, that their voices are becoming more and more heard. And to some extent, we may see a real scramble. The West perhaps needs to wake up the other parts of the world will just not blindly follow the West in terms of this and assume that the Western states are always doing the right things. And I think it's come as a bit of a shock to the United States and to some in the West. The many non-Western countries have not publicly condemned Russia for what's going on in Ukraine. And part of the reason for that is this is not that dissimilar from what's happened a couple of decades before in terms of what the US did in Iraq. Now, you can make a whole host of questions about whether that's right or wrong, but that I think is an important perception. This idea of double standards of Western dominance is something that needs to be challenged. The first way of getting to that is to try and tell the stories and to make sure we highlight the views from other parts of the world, and that's something that we've not been. There's some good reasons like language barriers, but there's some fabulous experts working in these other parts of the world that don't always get heard. There's a brilliant article, I think it just came through this morning, by Matthias Spector about the global South and their role in sort of the global order, and it gives you a really good idea. And I just can't imagine those sort of publications happening 20 or 30 years ago, but that's coming through. In terms of what comes next, it's, well, one, finish that team book, which is taking a bit longer than we'd hoped, but hopefully that'll be done in the next month or so, and then begin to really conceptualize what this means. So that the final or the penultimate slide to try and really unpack, what does this actually mean? How can I make this useful, rather than just here's a load of interesting things going on? What's the useful thing we can do? And I've still got some thinking to do around that. I don't quite know how that all works, but one of the things that underpins this and has underpinned my work more broadly is to try and get people interested in understanding this stuff. So, I've been working on this for nearly getting on for 20 years, certainly 15 years. I think it's really important. If we get this wrong, we don't get many second chances. And I think the general publics are beginning to wake up to the importance of this with Vladimir Putin's nuclear threats and with other stuff. But there's still a real dearth of understanding, particularly amongst the general public, but also in terms of policymakers. And I think that's a really important part. So one of the strands from this work is to say, the third nuclear age, nuclear weapons are important again. Right? You need to know about this stuff. You need to understand it. Whatever you think the solution is, and I have no. If you think we need to disarm, if you think deterrence works, we need to make it better, whatever, at least understand why you think that. Right, and understand the bits that come around it. So there's an education strand that links with this, and I suppose a kind of training strand that goes with it as well. We're lucky enough to have a number of different visiting fellows here at Leicester and people that have come in and spent time with this. So I suppose more selfishly is to try and turn Leicester into a bit of a hub where people can come and work, do projects, and build up this intellectual epistemic community of thinking around this, with the goal being a greater understanding, nuclear peace, not any particular outcome, not wedded to any particular outcome in terms of disarmament, deterrence, more or less nuclear weapons, but just to better thinking around the subjects. Sorry, it was a long-winded answer, wasn't it?
No, it was really interesting, actually. Thank you so much. I think in the interests of time, we will leave the questions there, but Andrew, if it's okay with you, I know that you shared your contact details at the beginning. I might pass that on to some of our EVN as well when I extend the recording to them in case they have any questions they'd like to ask you. But otherwise, thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today and for sharing your expertise on the third nuclear age. It was really, really helpful and really interesting. Don't know as much about this stuff, so for me, I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone else has as well. And I hope that it was an interesting and thought-provoking session for everyone who's joined today. Thank you to those of you who have found the time to join us live and for all of your questions. And thank you also to any of you who might be tuning in and watching virtually. As a reminder, I will send the recording to you very shortly after this session. And it will also be available on the BASIC website. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.